Hello again. I'm Father Michael Carson. I'm part of the podcast, the Church in Indian Country, with my esteemed colleague, Father David Bailey, from the Diocese of Tyler, Texas. I'm Assistant Director for Native American Affairs, and we're doing these podcasts once a month. Now we have a very special guest and a very important topic, and that is missing and exploited women and human trafficking. And so our guest today is Felicitas from the MRS, from our office. She's the expert, especially on human trafficking. So this is a very important subject, not only for the Subcommittee on Native American Affairs, but also for the USCCB. And it's also one of the major problems and concerns within the Native communities, especially the Native communities that are on reservations and the Native nations. So I'd just like to let Felicitas to introduce herself. Who are you? What's your background? And what's your experience working on human trafficking?
Thank you for having me. My name is Felicitas Brugo Onetti, and I am the Anti-Trafficking Education and Outreach Coordinator here for the U.S. Conference. I work in the Department of Migration and Refugess Services. A little bit about my background. So I'm from Argentina, Buenos Aires, and I grew up in Miami, Florida, and I pursued my both of my social work degrees in undergrad and in master's. I got my undergrad degree at Catholic University and then got my master's in social work at Florida State University. So a little bit about kind of my background is I did a lot of clinical social work, is more of like the direct therapy, working one-on-one with clients. And that's where I experienced a lot of trafficking victims. I worked extensively with migrant communities. I was very passionate about that population, specifically growing up in Florida and being an immigrant myself. I worked a lot with children and families and especially undocumented families. And then I kind of moved into the realms of working in prisons. I worked in a substance use rehabilitation clinic. I worked in foster care. I kind of jumped all over during my studies.
So why should Native communities, if somebody's watching this in this video, just give them a sales pitch of why should they get involved in this issue?
Yeah, so I mean, human trafficking is kind of rampant in all ethnicities and backgrounds and cultures. But of course, when we think of people who are most at risk in the United States, that always falls into these minority groups, right? Native Americans, African Americans, Hispanic, Latino, Asian Pacific Islanders. And so you have these communities will always be most at risk for the bigger problems in this world, for example. And so when we think of Native American communities and human trafficking, they're exceptionally at risk to become victims. And that kind of, it's all co-occurring, you know, in a lot of the issues that go around. It's not just like, oh, you're at risk for human trafficking and nothing else. But when you're at risk for, you know, poverty, for entering the foster care system, for substance use disorders, for all these things that are kind of integrated within our community or certain communities, you're going to always be of higher risk for perpetrators of violence, whether that's domestic violence, whether that's, you know, gang violence, whether that's human trafficking. So Native Americans are exceptionally in those places. And, you know, human trafficking, like a lot of other crimes, is one of the most underreported, you know, things that are on record. Because of the clandestine nature of the crime and people not reporting or having lack of resources and, you know, things like that. If in the general US population, there's such a lack of underreporting, imagine what it must be for Native American individuals. And so, you know, when we see Native Americans are at risk for so many other things like substance use dependency, poverty, experiences within the child welfare system, they're like 10 times higher than the average, you know, citizen. And then when we go into like the statistics on human trafficking, I think it's, you know, the CDC does a lot of the reporting on this stuff, and they say 25% of Native Americans are like victims within human trafficking, but they make up, you know, 2% of the population. And so when you have such, they present so little, they represent so little, in the general population, but then are, you know, the highest number of victims. And it goes into the same with Hispanic communities, right? You know, they make up 18% of the US population, but they are at skyrockets of 60% of, you know, human trafficking cases. And so that, you know, that is an important I think I would argue that that is the most important part as to why Catholic Native American community should be aware of this problem.
What are the problems of addressing this issue, especially with the Native American communities, but generally, what are the problems to address human trafficking?
Yeah, I mean, again, human trafficking is such a, secret hush hush operation. If it was so prevalent or so obvious that there wouldn't be any victims. And so I think that a lot of times it's hard for people to understand kind of what trafficking is, right? And so you have this like umbrella term of human trafficking, and then it breaks up into sex trafficking, and then labor trafficking, and then child trafficking and exploitation, and kind of goes into all these categories. And it varies, right? Like there's not a one type like fits all into what trafficking looks like. And it definitely doesn't discriminate too often. Like for the most part, people are disproportionately affected more than others, but anyone could be a victim. And so when you have these barriers of, someone that might be undocumented, that, their trafficker might hold their documents from them, or, may accuse them or hold them at danger, like threats of violence, of death, of, attacking their family members back home. Those are like unique risk factors that are within there of people that are like the issues to address. But then when we think of maybe more local citizens, you kind of see the same thing, fear of law enforcement, fear of getting in trouble, the legal fees, not understanding. They're manipulated. A lot of times with women, you see that they refer to their trafficker as their boyfriend or their significant other. And it's not just this like idea that everyone that is a victim knows they're a victim. A big problem when we're addressing human trafficking is that a lot of victims wouldn't consider themselves to be victims.
I've been involved in some types of social justice work for all my ordained priesthood, and facts and figures only go so far. Right. But I notice what really changes people's minds, get them enthusiastic and passionate about these issues, are the heart connection, the personal stories. From your work on human trafficking, is there a personal story that you can relate to again, to talk about this issue?
Yeah, so I personally don't have, a story of myself. I'm not a survivor by any means, but working a lot in therapy with victims, especially, I was working in a prison for some time in Florida in a women's federal prison. And I was there for unrelated, nothing to do with trafficking. I was there for a research study, but as you get to talk to a lot of people, as I'm doing a lot of the other stuff with the women, they start to tell you things, and you can see, that's when you really see that people might not know that they are victims or that they are being mistreated, when oftentimes, and it goes to the same when I was working in a substance use rehab clinic, the reality of a lot of vulnerable individuals is that violence is so common, and it's very much what people know. And so when you think of domestic violence, that kind of aligns a lot with human trafficking. It's like it takes, the stat is it takes 7 attempts of violence for the individual to leave when it comes to intimate partner violence. And so if we think of, someone that's 2 people that are dating, and it takes the victim, 7 times of an instance to go and leave and call the police or seek help. Imagine what it must be like when you are, a victim of trafficking, and you think you're dating your perpetrator. It's so deep into the like manipulation that it's very hard. So yeah, I did see a lot of these personal stories, and and they took different forms. You had the woman that was, being passed around within a gang. You had the girl that was just being, forced to do things in a high school from her peers. You had, I worked with victims that, were brought here, were smuggled into the US, and, we're victims of labor trafficking, where they're, where like the owner of the land was paying them 10 cents an hour to pick up, a bucket of cucumbers. And that's, what they had to do for the rest of their life. And because they're undocumented, they're never going to report. And their boss, held their documents and held all these things in which it was a really hard way to get out of something like that.
Oh, what are the signs of human trafficking?
Yeah, I think that, human trafficking, like the movement on human trafficking, has really grown in the past, decades, in the past couple of decades. And there's always this conversation of, how can we tell that there's a victim? And I think that this is, my personal opinion in some ways, but I think that there's good and bad things there. In a lot of ways, you can identify a victim, from people always say, when they're quiet, when they don't make eye contact. There's a lot of signs of someone that is always accompanied by someone else, like a bodyguard kind of thing, or like a male figure. Someone speaks for them. A lot of times you can see like lack of hygiene, malnutrition, people that are maybe have very low self-esteem, which can be very general, but might, it comes from like this kind of submissive like role. You can also, people that have scripted responses can be like that. And so, flight attendants get trained a lot on this stuff, on how to identify a victim. And a lot of flight attendants have been successful in identifying someone, which is great. But these are such big responsibilities for someone to have. And so I think the Blue Campaign, which is, the Department of Homeland Security's big thing on trafficking, does a really unique thing, which is, or is kind of moving towards this unique path that there's a lot of ways to identify a victim, and you can see a victim from a lot of these warning signs. But it's also really important to hear the stories of victims and how maybe they were identified. There's a lot of survivors today that are coming out with their stories and sharing everything they went through. And there's a lot of books and a lot of those, conversations. But the the Blue Campaign on DHS has a lot of indicators, and, you can find a lot of that stuff online.
Can I jump in for a moment?
Go for it. Yes.
Couple of statistics. First and foremost, the famous statistic obviously is that as of 2016, there were 5,712 cases of missing and murdered Indigenous persons in the United States, out of which at that time in 2016, only 116 had been logged into the Department of Justice databases at that time. And also to go to the point that you just made about the borders, of course, I'm a priest in the Diocese of Tyler, which is in the state of Texas. One of the things that you just mentioned about asking Homeland Security and Border Patrol and these people about missing cases of Indigenous, or how many of the people who are missing or murdered are Indigenous. Okay. One of the reoccurring problems that is consistent in the underreporting of the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous persons is that they are misidentified because ethnically, number one, the majority of people in the United States, when they see a person that's Native American, they assume they're Hispanic.
Yes.
Because it's not on our radar that Indians still exist. Okay, absolutely. That's one problem. And that happens consistently. Your immediate go-to is they must be Hispanic. Mm-hmm. In some cases, especially for some of the people from the Pacific Northwest, they can be misidentified as being Asian. And in cases, especially like with certain tribes, like in Oklahoma and other places where there's a lot of intermarriage between either non-natives, Caucasian and natives, or non-natives, African-American and natives, they can be misidentified as either being Caucasian or African-American. But it is a problem that consistently the statistics for Native persons or Indigenous persons in the United States and Canada that are missing and or are murdered are notoriously underreported for precisely that reason. They are often misidentified ethnically by their physical appearance.
Yeah, completely. And I think that and I guess it begs the question of like, are we supposed to be, the people that are reporting these things or documenting it or whatnot should be, I would say, fixing, the wrong identifications in terms of, because I think that when people, when you hear the number like 5,700 are missing, but only 116 were reported, it's like, oh, they totally messed up the numbers. And it's not that big of a problem, but it is. And like, we already know that underreporting is almost in everything, right? Nothing is ever fully reported to like the best of its ability. But when we see, but there is truth to statistics will always bring value, right? Facts will always bring value when it comes to research, when it comes to funding, when it comes to seeing the progress of communities. In social work, you see that a lot. There's always the follow-up. What is the study? What's going on? you know, if in this rehab, for example, it's like, you know, if a client 0% of clients return after graduating from the rehab program. That's a success rate, right? You want things to stay low because you want people to succeed. And so when we see, you know, 5,700 were missing, but only 116 were actually of the Native American community. Oh, it's not that big of a problem, because what's 100 people to 5,000? When in fact, it's all these things that you're saying, right? That they're considered Hispanic or Asian, or they are identified through whoever, you know, they marry. And then it's like, what, do these numbers go to 3,000? Like, would that make people care? And it shouldn't, but in some ways it's like, because of the lack of numbers, it's not that big of a problem, or people aren't worried about this problem when they should be.
Right. Especially when you consider that the missing and murdered Indigenous, first and foremost, I mean, well, for one thing, we're talking about a problem that goes way back. I mean, if you really want to be honest, the exploitation of Native women and their being taken from their communities goes all the way back to first contact and colonization, right?
Absolutely.
And it's never stopped in 500 years. But also, we talk about communities in which violence is endemic. For example, you know, 84% of American Indian and Alaska Native females will say that they have experienced violence within their lifetimes, while 1 in 3 of them experience sexual violence. 70% of violence against Native women is, according to the Department of Justice, perpetrated by non-Natives, whereas 96% of rapes against Native American women are perpetrated by non-Native men. And meanwhile, it's a problem in which the vast majority of Native communities are all too familiar. And I think, going back to kind of what I was saying a minute ago and what you're saying about awareness, I think part of the reason why that's not in the mindset of your average person in the United States is because of this thing, which a lot of Native people don't like this term, but you know, the invisible minority. They're not on anybody's radar. People aren't even aware. Like, I, for example, had a professor who wanted me to escort her to some Native communities to do some research that she was doing. And this particular professor was from the state of Louisiana. And I said, I will be happy to take you to Native communities to introduce you to people to do your research. However, have you considered going to the Native communities in the state of Louisiana before I take you up to South Dakota or Montana? And she was astonished. She said, I didn't know there were Native communities in Louisiana. But yeah, that's the problem. Most people aren't.
Right.
I mean, even in my diocese, I'm only 2 hours away from a federally recognized reservation, the Alabama Coshawta.
Right.
The vast majority of people, I guarantee you, aren't even aware that they exist.
Totally. That, I think that's part of like, oh, I didn't even know, you know, there was one in my community. And then you have the other end of the spectrum that's kind of like, oh, they're on these reservations that we can't cross and we can't touch. And so like, they have their own government and their own things. And so I'm going to stay like in my lane, which
right.
I understand like the argument, but it's either like, oh, this invisible minority, what you were saying, or it's just like, no, they live in the US, but they're not really like part of us, and all these other barriers. And so we don't like to get in the middle because they have their own FBI, they have their own and all these things, right? And so then it's like everyone else is kind of like, what do we do?
Right. And unfortunately, there's actually a third category, which is a much uglier component, which is the fact that a lot of times people I'm not going to mention states or, you know, whatever, but I'm not picking on anybody. But look, it's a fact that like back when Tina Fontaine, a young, I think 15, 16-year-old Anishinaabe or Ojibwe Native woman in Canada was pulled out of the Red River in Manitoba, nobody turned an eye to that. Nobody paid any attention to that because it was just another native body being pulled out of the river. And one of the things that really got the community to paying attention in that case was the detective that was in charge of the investigation, who was a person from Ireland, Detective O'Donoghue, who made this appeal in the media, saying that there is a predator on the loose in your community, and your children could be next. Now all of a sudden it applies to me. Now all of a sudden I care. But the reality is, in a lot of the cases, especially in states where there are a lot of reservations, Montana, South Dakota, Minnesota, et cetera, or in certain Canadian provinces, Alberta, Saskatchewan, where there are a lot of natives, there's also a lot of anti-native racism. And so there are a lot of people, this uglier component, which says, yeah, another native went missing, and what happened? They probably were prostituting themselves. It's, in other words, it's victim blaming.
Absolutely. Or they're like these insane alcoholics, and
all
they do is gamble.
And they're all prostituting themselves to finance their next hit.
And they're in the casinos. What do you expect to happen?
It's victim blaming, and it's negative stereotypes. And so it's that element of racism. So you either didn't know that they were there at all, or you did know that they were there, but you had these completely terrible negative impressions of them based on racist ideologies.
Right. No, totally. And I think that, you mentioned South Dakota, and there's a statistic that's like 40% of reported victims were Native women in South Dakota, even though they make up 8% of the population. That's crazy, and then it's in New Mexico, it's like 1/4 of trafficking victims are Native American in New Mexico, but they make up 11%. And it's just like these insane statistics, but it totally goes into that whole like victim blaming mentality, or just these like, I think that we see it a lot in a lot of topics in the US. You see like everything with migration, right? And that could be any type of it. It goes into like, oh, we're going to help, we're going to continue funding things for immigration when like our kids in foster care aren't even, like our foster care system is completely corrupted and horrible, which is, there's a lot of arguments to support that, but like, these are not like mutually exclusive things. There could be multiple problems and multiple things going on at once to help solve them. And I think it's very much of that mentality. And I think human trafficking in general, specifically within Native communities, but it's like, that's never going to happen to me.
Right.
I'm, I live in the best neighborhood, and I've done everything for my kids to be, in the best school and the best this and which is great and true.
Right.
But it's everywhere. And then people, I think, also have these ideas that it's like, oh my gosh, it's, don't ever take candy from a stranger. And that's like so far from, what's actually happening. I think COVID continued to prove that, recruitment went like up by 125% on Facebook, which owns like Instagram and WhatsApp, right? And that's where all recruitment went on during the pandemic. And it's like all these ideas that like you're walking on the street and you're going to get kidnapped and like shoved into this man with a thing on your head. And although that probably has happened, and that does happen still, that's not the way things are done anymore. And people are recruiting in a lot of different ways. And a lot of times it's, it's your friend, it's your peer, it's your classmate, it's someone from work or whatnot, or within your community. It's the same thing with domestic violence. Most of the time, Polaris Project reports that, like, I don't know what the stat is, but let's say, don't quote me on this, but let's say half is like you're recruited by a family member into trafficking. And I can share all these stats with you all, but that's the most common because it's part of a ring, because it's so secret. It's not just like you need like ways in and out of here.
Incidentally, I think it's interesting that the statistic that you just pointed out regarding the state of South Dakota with the cases of missing people versus the overall state population, it is almost exactly the same statistic as the number of natives in the prison system in South Dakota versus the overall statewide population. Overall statewide population of natives in the state of South Dakota is something like 9%. Whereas it's over 40% of the state of South Dakota prison population are natives also.
Wow.
Right? It's almost the exact same correlation of the statistic there.
Yeah, and I think that it's just mind-blowing how disproportionate it is. It's like they're minorities, but we're the majority of everything.
Right.
And I think that's like what people forget. They're like, oh, minorities. So like not, but minorities by like,
but they're low in numbers, but they lead in the percentages, right?
Always.
And meanwhile, the statistic for murders amongst Native people is that it's the third highest cause of death. Murder is the third highest cause of
homicide,
death. Right, for natives, right, absolutely. For Native women.
And I think then there's like I think after it's like violence towards women is like number 5 or 6.
Right, and then okay, again, going back to the game of, okay, so basically I think of the last census is something like 2-something million self-identified Native people in the United States. Now, self-identified means they're telling you they're Native. You don't know if they are or not. They're saying that my great-great-grandmother was Cherokee, therefore I'm Native. But as far as actually tribally enrolled natives, the number is much less than 2 million. So less than 1% of the national population is comprised by indigenous people in the United States. And yet, Native women from the ages of 15 to 24 have suicidal ideation or attempt suicide at an average of 6 times the national average. And Native men in the same age range, 15 to 24, have the same correlation of statistics, suicidal ideation or suicidal attempts at a rate of 3 times the national average. And yet this is a demographic that comprises less than 1% of the total Native population or the total national population.
That's crazy.
It absolutely, yes, it is. Well, and then the victim blaming comes in, where we're blaming them as though it's a Native problem. But like I said, in the cases of the 1 out of 3 Native women who will be sexually assaulted, according to the Department of Justice, 70% of those assaulters or those attackers are non-Natives.
Right.
And 90%, 96% of rapists in cases of Native Americans who are raped, 96% are non-Native men. So it's not a Native problem. I mean, it's a problem that affects Natives, but it's not an internal, they just need to get their stuff together kind of problem. But that's what a lot of people think.
One of the most important part for me is the connection between human trafficking and murdered and exploited women. That's very important, especially working with the natives. We have large tribes on both borders, on the New Mexico border, or on the Mexico border and the Canadian border. So in terms of watching for these issues and concerns, that's a big concern, especially working with law enforcement and others. How do we get parishes and tribal communities, tribal governments involved, and what are the resources that are available to these people who want to get involved in this issue?
The government, DHS does a lot of the Blue campaign, and although I would argue lack a little bit on the cultural diversity side of things, specifically Native American communities, they do have a pretty big, robust like webinars and trainings and things like that. I think that churches and communities have a responsibility to kind of educate themselves and bring awareness, even if you don't have someone leading that. There's a lot of Catholic nonprofits that are doing a lot of stuff, and a lot of non-Catholic prophets that are doing a lot of stuff. And I know that there a lot of Native American communities, there's a website called tribaltrafficking.org, and they do a lot of like the sex trafficking in Indian country. And, it seems that a lot of when we talk about trafficking in Native American communities, it always goes towards sex trafficking. And not that that's not prevalent and that's not true, but then because it connects to this whole like missing and murdered, women and children. But we need to, I think human trafficking always goes towards sex trafficking in most conversations. And you see it a lot in like the resources and a lot of the things, as I just said, a lot in Native American communities, which is because it's probably most prevalent, but there needs to be a little bit more dialogue on just what that looks like overall, even though the market can be different in different ways. But tribal trafficking has a lot of resources that I saw, and it goes by state, and I think they have some like free people to talk with and to like kind of get help. Then they also have like a state by state like guide of things, and then there's the Human Trafficking Capacity Building Center Development of Justice has a lot of information. The USCCB has a Become a Shepherd program, which focuses on parish lay religious people and individuals within the church to kind of be educated and aware on the topic of trafficking and know what to do if they ever spot a victim. which is always to contact the police or to call the hotline. We can also add all that information. And so there's a lot of ways to get involved. I think donating is can always be helpful. There's a lot of free webinars. We have a lot of free webinars. And just continuing to do research, and maybe the FBI of Indian country has some things as well, and reaching out to them and being like, you guys need more things, step it up is also important to kind of advocate for your community.
I think one of the most important resources is yourself. So could you give people your email address in case someone can contact you?
Yes, my email is F as in Frank, ONETTI @usccb.org. And I would love to share any information. I have something that I think we are hoping to do here at the conference is develop some stuff within cultural diversity and starting with Native American communities. Father Michael and I will be hopefully working on a project. So this is as well a plea for help. If anyone out there, wants to help, give advice, give suggestions, give recommendations, please do. We are, hoping to kind of get a board of people that will help us kind of navigate all this stuff and be sensitive to the communities that we're working with. I think that the bishops really want to kind of launch this, initiative. Pope Francis has been very big on the topic. There's a lot of really good Catholic nonprofits here in the US, like the US Catholic Sisters Against Human Trafficking, and they are super passionate about this topic. And sisters, the religious sisters have been the fighters of trafficking since, the beginning of all of it. And so, looking to them for guidance is always great. Talitha Kum, which is an international organization, does a lot of work on human trafficking. And they are great. The Santa Marta Group, which is a coalition in London with the Pope, in Rome, with the Pope and law enforcement, they are doing a lot of stuff on human trafficking. And so looking at those, St. Thomas University in Florida, the College of Law has a trafficking academy. They do a lot of stuff. And most religious, the Felician Sisters, the Missionary Oblates of Mary, Immaculate, all of them do a lot of extensive work on the abolition of modern day slavery and human trafficking. And so looking towards them is really helpful. I'm hoping to kind of gather a resource page here at the USCCB website, and hopefully we can kind of make a bigger list of all the big organizations that do a lot of stuff. Again, Department of Homeland Security, Polaris Project, Love 146, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. There's a lot of really great people fighting this.
Very good. And thank you for your good work. And I hope to work very closely with you, especially when we take all this material and all these aspects and apply them to Native communities. Any last words from Father David or yourself?
I just want to echo your comments there, Father Carson, and thanking Felicity for the excellent work that she is doing. Thanks be to God that we have people like you fighting the fight, and just, God bless you and keep doing what you're doing. And if there's ever anything that I can do, by all means, please reach out. I'm happy to help in any way that I can.
Of course. Thank you both so much for having me. I hope anyone that, hears this is inspired to learn more and ask questions. I will do my best to answer them, and just, keep praying for victims and for the people that are doing, what they can. Saint Josephine Bakhita is really great saint that represents all this stuff. So, saying her prayer is awesome and helpful, and, just doing the most research that needs to be done. So thank you both. And signing off. I don't know what happens now.
What happens now is Father Carson's going to lead us in prayer.
Yeah, you talked about prayer. So let's do that right now. In the name of the Father, the Son,
and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Bless you, Lord our God. We give you thanks for coming together once again in this podcast. We also give you thanks for our discussion on this very important issue. We ask your prayer, your work and effort to help us as we work not only with human trafficking, but the missing and exploited women. We ask you especially to comfort those who are victims of this horrible crime, and to inspire others to get involved in this and transform the world into a better place. Amen.
Amen.